now. So a warm welcome to everyone. I'm Angela Daly. I am the co-director of the Strathclyde Centre for Internet Law and Policy with my colleague Liz Andrew. Here, a warm welcome to all of you and thanks for joining us. This is the February edition of our monthly webinar series. It was a seminar series, but since last year we're online and will be online for the foreseeable future. We're delighted to welcome our colleague, Dr. Michel Wahome, to give February's presentation on her research on internet governance and the involvement or lack of involvement of developing country actors in internet governance processes, with a particular focus on WSIS. Michelle is a new member of staff at the University of Strathclyde. She's actually based in the One Ocean Hub as a responsible innovation fellow, and her background is in critical approaches to STS studies and innovation. So we're delighted to have Michelle with us, and without further ado, I'll leave it over to her.
Thank you, Angela. I'm happy to be with you this afternoon. I'll go right into the presentation. So I'll be speaking for about half an hour and then open up to discussion. I'll share my screen. I hope you can all see that. And begin the slideshow. Right, so I will be talking about power geometries of global internet governance, and I'll explain what I mean as I go along. So I'll begin with a background to the study, explain what I see as the problem, and discuss what the implications for internet governance might be. Okay. And then open up to discussion, as I said. Let me know if any audio internet issues happen, and then I can restart or reiterate what I had said, probably by audio rather than chat, because I won't be able to see the chat. So the background to this study is my doctoral work. I was studying Silicon Savannah, which is a digital entrepreneurship ecosystem in Nairobi. And I characterized it as an arena of expectation where digital entrepreneurs were making these promises around what their products could do in order to attract users, investors. And through these narratives, they ended up creating a community, an ecosystem, and organizations and infrastructures that were now called Silicon Savannah. So because I was interested in how Silicon Savannah had come to be and why it was operated the way it did, I took a biographical approach. So understanding the historical context, doing critical discourse analysis around the policy environment 10 years ago and how the policies had evolved in order to create certain behaviors in the present time. And I used ethnographic methods, so I was there for about a year. I spoke to people in person, and one of the benefits of taking this sort of historical approach where I am reviewing blogs and other digital content and documents was that in the interviews, I could probe their memory to some extent, because as you will know, people have a tendency to remember things in a way that either valorizes the past or, as they have different experiences, their memories of what the process was kind of changes. So having this historical approach I was able to say, but if you look back, this is what is actually written about what happened. And that led to very fruitful exchanges and a focus around how narrative becomes infrastructure, right? One of the main sources of this kind of ability to look back was an email archive of an organization called Clickthenet. So that's the Kenya ICT Action Network. It is a multi-stakeholder organization. And they had all their emails since 2005 for me to look through and sort of be able to track their trajectory over time. And one of the main findings at the end of all of this was the power of narrative infrastructure to create actual materialities and relationships that end up being an ecosystem and a sort of living and tangible organization. And there's this idea of fabrication. So not necessarily deliberate lies or falsehoods necessarily, but making promises, creating expectations, and in that process, also as you make up these stories, you're also creating and making. So I used the word fabrication in both those senses to give an idea that even though it wasn't necessarily always accurate, the promises they were making, they did end up creating organizations, startups, policies, and all these relationships that ended up holding a community together that is now known as Silicon Savannah. And so this is a key concept that runs, that's the common thread throughout this presentation, is that powerful actors can structure and legitimate through visions, their imaginations, and what they say. So we have this sense that a lot of the structuring of societies around what is codified, policies, and sort of legislative elements. But in fact, a lot of what holds things together is what we believe, what we imagine, and what we claim. So Clickthenet, like I said, is a multi-stakeholder organization, and it was established in 2005 by the Association for Progressive Communications. If you're familiar at all with WSIS, is that APC was a very important actor, particularly in driving the civil society engagement at WSIS. And they were funded by DFID, which is the UK's aid organization, to establish a program called CATIA, which is Catalyzing Access to ICTs in Africa. And through this program, they established these multi-stakeholder organizations in country. And the goal was to have them influence internet policy in country and also participate in the larger WSIS process. So Clickthenet is very influential when it comes to Kenya's internet policy. The membership included, for instance, the permanent secretary for ICTs in Kenya, as well as the CEOs of important companies, like if you know anything about Kenya's mobile development, Safaricom, and other NGOs, and they all acted in as developed strategies, implemented policy, but they were much less active when it came to the engagement with WSIS. I'm receiving a message that my internet connection is unstable, so let me know if so with WSIS, they were not that engaged, and that comes through in the email conversations. I've quoted one where some of the people who were trying to drive the momentum around that would send these emails, the documents, invite people to prep meetings, but not have that much engagement. So it's like, don't you care what's happening? Can I have some feedback? But the interesting thing is that when you read the reports of WSIS, Kenya often comes across as a positive case study. So those who were engaged, I did do a good job of representing Kenya at the process. But when you review the communications at the Clickthenet, you see that there's much more engagement when it comes to national policy, but with the WSIS process is actually not that much interest. So you will likely know what WSIS is, and it was a solution to the inherent global power asymmetries that were emerging around internet governance. And these asymmetries mirror the general dominance of Western nations and the desire to include developing countries that you find in a lot of global governance, that it wasn't inherently a trait of internet governance per se, but it was very pronounced, particularly because of the role of the United States in terms of institutional oversight. And so part of the agenda for the 2005 meeting was around shifting towards a more global oversight role. And it was particularly important for developing countries to talk about how to finance the infrastructural development that brings internet to the masses. In the end, I think the general consensus was that not much was achieved. The solution that everyone agreed upon was enhanced cooperation, which I translate as over time, we will have more global oversight. But for now, we'll let the status quo remain and the US can have its large role. And over time, you see things evolve and change. But at the 2005 meeting, that was basically what was agreed. The APC, as I mentioned, was a very important actor. And a lot of their legitimacy came from being able to say that we established these national multi-stakeholder organizations and we represent them at this meeting. We have interacted with them, we've had prep meetings, we've shared knowledge with them and heard from them. And so we can represent their interests at this meeting. So that idea of how to legitimate yourself through a managed consensus is an interesting topic that I'll touch on as I go on. So WSIS is kind of succeeded by IGF, although every 5 years or so there's a kind of a meeting to remember 2005 and also build on what good outcomes might have emerged from that meeting. But also visible in the reports and as they progress. So after 2005, there is some sense that maybe something was achieved, but as time goes on, and the wisdom of hindsight, there's a growing skepticism around multi-stakeholderism and what it's able to achieve in terms of including less powerful actors. So the critique tends to be that these meetings can be somewhat performative, that they provide a sense of agency that's not actually real. And what ends up happening is that there's a maintaining of the status quo rather than any sort of disruption that allows people to participate in decision-making. There's also a critique around how the processes can be quite impenetrable, that you have to learn how to participate in these fora, and it's not intuitive in any way, that they are on the back foot, that they tend to lack foresight and therefore are reactive rather than proactive, and a general sense that they can be somewhat ineffectual. But at the end of that, the question is, so what? Because there are lots of institutions around the world that are this way, and isn't internet governance happening anyway? So even if you have one that is somewhat of just bringing people together to have a chat, what's wrong with that? For me, the so what is around the fact that I don't believe that WSIS is that ineffectual. In fact, because of its positioning, I think that it was actually quite influential. And this is evident, I will show, in how Clickthenet talked about the internet and what its agenda is. You can see that the agenda was already set, it was almost preset. And my issue with it is that there's a sort of misplaced technological determinism and a sense of universalism that reveals a bias about what progress is and what it should look like, right? And it's taken for granted, and so it normalizes particular agendas instead of interrogating them. And all of this power stems from power geometry, which is an idea by Doreen Massey that certain geographies have more influence and more power than others. And I argue that if WSIS took that idea seriously, which it claims to do by trying to include others, it could leverage its power to change the agenda, to shift the agenda, to shift the conversation so that it is actually more inclusive. Instead, what it does is includes people into a predetermined model of what should be, instead of having a debate around what the agenda actually is. So when people in Clickthenet asked, why didn't you care about WSIS in 2005? Why were you more focused on the national agenda? Some of the responses are like, Africa needs to be concerned about developing internet usage first, rather than dwelling on who governs the internet and how. And then, they might go on to list what is needed, usually infrastructure issues, graduating ICT professionals, accessing the internet on mobile phones, all of these accessibility questions, and that the sense that the way the internet was governed allowed for all of this. So why take on these questions? And for me, this is evidence of the fact that the agenda had already been set to some extent. The desire to put access before governance and not think of governance before access seemed to be sort of taken for granted, a taken for granted idea that was absorbed all the way in Kenya as well, even by people who weren't actively participating in the global process. These ideas had been transmitted and absorbed. 10 years later, as I look over the archive, I start to see contestations around governance beginning to emerge. And the trigger was a celebration around the uptake of mobile broadband in Kenya, which is a kind of globally known success case study, right? So 90% rates of mobile phone uptake. And there was some celebration taking place around this fact. But then other actors in this multi-stakeholder forum were arguing that it wasn't actually a case study of success, that the goal had been computing technology, making sure that people had access to computing technology. So in fact, the fact that the internet was mainly being accessed through mobile phones or not at all was kind of a consolation prize. And this turns into a very big conflagration and a bone of contention that leads to debates around the privatization of infrastructure, net neutrality. Who said net neutrality is something we should care about? Who are you to speak for people in rural areas? You're an elite. You're not even Kenyan. It actually gets quite personal as you look through these emails. There's the charge that civil society actors, because their bread and butter is to represent marginalized people, that they somehow in some way exploit them, that it's the role of government to be caring about the citizens and the polity. And so to me, as I look through this, it was clear to me that this idea that access, making sure that everyone had access to the internet and making governance subordinate had been a terrible one. That they should at least have occurred side by side, or that governance should actually precede the question of whether access is actually a requirement. Why have we taken for granted the idea that we must bridge the digital divide? Why isn't that interrogated a little more? What should we have in place before the bridge is built? Should we have a gate? Is there anyone watching to see what comes over the bridge? But because we'd taken for granted that the internet was a right and it was required by everyone, some more important conversations hadn't yet taken place. And this becomes very clear at around a 10-year mark, 2015, thereabouts. So when I thought through what this might be saying, I considered that the somewhat controversial conclusion that maybe there was a misplaced focus on advocacy for this technology. As a science and technology studies scholar, we have a mantra that technology is neither good nor bad, but it's not neutral. It's impossible to depoliticize it. The goal of trying to bring everyone together around a particular agenda as a means of depoliticizing it and making sure that everyone benefits actually is not particularly possible. What is true is that our socio-technical imaginaries, what we imagine about technology and its abilities, actually shapes society. So it's not that we can exist mutually exclusive from the outcomes of technology. It doesn't operate in a sort of separate realm, one that is either good or bad. If you make assumptions about its benevolence, you might end up perversely including people in something that exploits them. Or if you worry too much about its harms, you might end up preventing people from accessing potential benefits. And what WSIS's conclusion around enhanced cooperation did was allow for the privatization of governance. It sort of ceded its control over the process by kicking the can down the road, by not grabbing the fact that technologies will have influence and we will be influenced by the technologies as well, this mutual shaping process. By not grabbing that by the horns, they generally ceded the governance to private corporations primarily, and then governments, national governments or regional bodies having to then follow what the corporations are doing. So these companies have proved to have the ability and the willingness to shape our societies, right? And we tend to take that for granted as a natural outcome, as something that cannot be mitigated against until it happens. So for instance, with Uber, all these debates around labor rights that are now emerging because of gig economy work, and who should have a say over that. It's possible to imagine a scenario where a body like WSIS could have maybe not had the foresight to envision such an outcome, but to at least lay the groundwork for what is allowed and what isn't, rather than hoping for enhanced cooperation amongst government agencies who end up even not having the power over these private interests. Concerns over privacy emerge after the privacy has been challenged because we are so predisposed towards urging connectivity first, right? Do we see these technologies as either technologies that support movement building, or are they for radicalization? These things are not something that you necessarily would have been able to foresee, but by being champions for the technology, you would never have been able to mitigate it against it anyway, right? So this misplaced focus on advocating for the technology rather than thinking about its governance very clearly from the outset leads to this space where it's a sort of free-for-all, where the person creating the technology is the one who determines how it's governed, right? And if we cede to governments only, is that the problem is that they have to engage in politics. Politics exist in all arenas, yes, but they exist through electoral processes. These are the concerns that they have always. There's no way for governments to step away from the politics of the issue, right? And when it comes to developing countries, they have the added issue of not having the resources perhaps to think through these questions or the expertise. And because of the political engagement, there's a problem sometimes with state capture, where the private interests capture the political ones and the political agenda. So which agency then has the power to legitimate, to imagine alternatives and shape the trajectory of things? And most importantly, not to take things for granted, not to take it for granted that all technologies are desirable or all technologies might be harmful, but to interrogate all these assumptions. Whose responsibility is it to be critical? If you read the kind of promises and expectations that emerge out of WSIS processes, they tend to be, we promise that we will ensure that everyone has access to internet and that the infrastructure is in place. But who critiques these agendas? Who says, is this what we want? Often it seems it's only an academic question amongst 10 people writing in a journal. But as Muravyov writes, that this focus only on the formal and legal aspects of governance that misses all these underlying assumptions, the mundane practices, the role of technology itself in determining governance. Every time you read or not read these terms and policies, they just check the box when Google asks you to do that. Of course, now, as time has gone on, there's a lot more oversight, much less so in developing countries. In Europe, it's much more stringent. If you're in Kenya, sometimes you will be asked whether or not you want to accept cookies, but that is determined by whether that company is established in Europe or not. But for countries like Kenya, who haven't necessarily established these frameworks, who offers any guidance? And it requires an organization that understands this idea of power geometry, that some places, their ideas, they're not only just their technologies, but the way their worldviews are transmitted much more easily than knowledge and ideas from other places. And once you understand that the power and the influence you might have, you are more likely to curb or interrogate your actions, or at least I think that's what should happen. So my contention is that WSIS, IGF, these are the places where this kind of thinking could happen, instead of simply being a fora that attempts to include people by bringing them together and in some ways indoctrinating them into a particular worldview. It could be a place where the worldview itself is challenged, right? And the agendas are challenged. And in that way, shaping alternative forms and adoptions of technology and rules around the adoption of technology. Hopefully all this is making sense. So this slide, I try to concretize what it is I'm saying, is by imagining what might have been. So instead of this idea of enhanced cooperation, Levison and Coburn have what they call the idea of evolving enactments. So both of them have this sense of evolution that as more information is gathered, power might be ceded to others. But somewhat of the complacency that is imbued in the idea of enhanced cooperation, it becomes more concrete in the idea of evolving enactments. If you read Levison and Coburn, the idea is that the structures, the body or organization that's overseeing internet governance becomes much more active in determining its own agenda rather than waiting for its membership to guide its process. And it then will produce policies that are not universalisms based on some sort of modernity bias about what progress looks like, but rules that can be reinterpreted in places like developing countries in ways that suit them. So maybe at the very beginning, when you don't know what the trajectory of the internet will be, will it be used for good or for ill? You can have more general rules like don't technology such as this one should not exploit. And then a country, let's say Kenya, can take that rule to decide what that means for itself. But having a general, if you contrast this with the general idea of let's bridge the digital divide, in that idea of let's bridge the digital divide, there is no critique or sense that there could be negative outcomes from that, right? And so what happens is that the people who are creating the policies will only end up creating mitigating policies for harm once a harm emerges, but there's no preparation for the potential of harm. Net neutrality, for instance, was a policy that was thought of as positive, that it was based around this assumption that access is the best thing for everyone. And so, but later on we see that it's quite controversial with the free, particularly that free basics and Facebook and India conversation that was also had in Kenya around whether access is actually limited by the policy of net neutrality. So the specificity of net neutrality makes it a rule that isn't necessarily universally applicable or useful. So the question is, how do you develop policies that are universal but can be engaged with at the local level? And throughout this, what I've tried to convey is that there should be some sort of preliminary precaution. So governance before access, before this sense that the internet is the sort of solution for all, a panacea for all ills. It'll, people will be able to create economic opportunities from it. They'll be better informed, this, that, and the other, create content. And if you really think about it, why was this the expectation? not, if you're the one producing the technology or developing the technology, I can see why you'd have this sort of benevolent sense of what the technology can do. But for everyone else, there should have been a more cautious approach, right? And in terms of in evolving enactments, there's this idea of having foresight or attempting to have it. So the ability to develop foresight is an expertise, right? And that should be embedded in an organization like the one we are envisioning right now, is by paying attention to what I call the hidden processes. You don't necessarily have to be clairvoyant. For instance, we currently know that Google and Facebook are planning for undersea cables to Africa to increase the infrastructural ability of people in Africa to connect to the internet. We can develop some ideas about what that might mean for users and start to imagine what rules we'd want to develop around that. So there's no need for any sort of psychic abilities, but just to pay attention to what's happening and to imagine potential outcomes. And this idea of multi-stakeholderism as the goal, I think creates, as I mentioned before, and many people have critiqued multi-stakeholderism for this reason, of creating a sense of agency where there is none. So a sense of inclusion, but it's not a substantive form of inclusion. So what if you didn't pretend that you were representing all actors or all interests, but what you do is indicate which actors and which interests are represented in the conversation at that moment. And as you evolve, try and include relevant and expertise and new information. What counts as expertise is also something that needs to be discussed. But when there's this sense of evolution, that opens up the fora for various kinds of expertise and knowledge to participate. And as more evidence is gathered, the organization adjusts to make relevant legal frameworks or regulations or develop support for that matches the evidence. One thing that I will say that was evident through this review of the WSIS process over time is that they were very focused on knowledge exchange. They really did their best to try and get people up to speed on how to participate in WSIS and IGF. But whether that was successful or not is something that needs to be considered, and how to improve knowledge exchange. I would say the main key takeaway is that it does need to be an exchange. The modernity bias that I mentioned before tends to, I will say, indoctrinate people into a particular worldview, that this is how progress is made. But what if others were able to contribute their views of what innovation is, what progress looks like, what these technologies should be able to do? Often I will read critiques of developing country use of ICTs as, well, they don't generate a lot of content. Instead, they just like to use WhatsApp and that kind of thing. And or we created a market information software, but the farmers aren't using it to find out the prices for their crops and that sort of thing. But rather than see that as a failure, there ought to be lessons about what it is users actually want the technology for. And so the exchange has to happen. It cannot just be a one-way conversation about what the internet is for and how it should help people. And as I mentioned, a critique of WSIS was that the processes can be somewhat impenetrable. You know, knowing how to write those, you know, considering well, you know, those UN speak and the formatting and all of these are issues that might be considered insignificant, but they do determine how well people can participate in these processes. So finding a way to make them straightforward and simple, and noticing that not everyone can attend or has any interest in attending. How do you ensure that the legitimacy of your claim that you've managed a consensus it remains something that you can claim. Maybe, like I said, there's no need to claim that that has happened at all. You can be clear on who has been able to participate and who hasn't. And maybe it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world when sometimes not everyone can be there, with a view to being more inclusive as you evolve. So I've come to the end of my presentation, and I'll now open to discussion and any questions. Thank you.